I don't know. I think I tried mine out like 4 times. And then I kind of thought I might be too old for this. I don't know.
You're never too old.
Ain't that the
Unless you
truth?
fall and your bones are brittle or something. Who do we?
Okay.
Who are we? Okay. Yeah, this might be everybody for this meeting.
Okay.
Kenmore City Council is now in session. Would the clerk please take the roll?
Deputy Mayor O'Kane,
Present.
Councilmember Marshall,
Present.
Mayor Herbig,
Here.
Councilmember Kugler,
Here.
Councilmember File,
Present.
Councilmember Baker,
Excused.
Councilmember Shrubnik.
Excused.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Assuming that nobody, unless there's objection to the agenda, we will, the agenda will stand approved. Hearing no objection, the agenda stands approved as published. Next on the agenda after that is 2 presentations. Our first is Puget Sound Energy Update presented by Andy Wappler, Senior Vice President and Chief Customer Officer. Mr. Wappler.
Hello, just firing up my camera here as I've been invited in as a panelist, which I very much appreciate. Let me just make sure I get this all started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I appreciate it. Really appreciate having the chance to talk about a couple different subjects that I think are interrelated and certainly top of mind. What can be done about neighborhood reliability and what's been done on that. What's happening bigger picture around clean energy in the region and what we're trying to do with that and how that can help with your goals as a council and as a city around climate. And then really kind of the piece that's in the middle tonight is kind of our focus, which is we've worked a lot on the neighborhood level pieces the last couple of years, and thanks so much to the city for helping make that happen. And before I dive into that, I just have to mention how helpful over the years Nancy Owsley was as deputy city manager, all of her work, all the city staff, and certainly city manager Carl Lindsay here today. Without the staff, it's a lot of permits, it's a lot of time. None of those improvements can happen. And I think I appreciate that, especially in the last couple of years. It's been hard for everyone as we've shifted to new ways of working, and yet the expectations for the progress haven't slowed down. In fact, maybe they've picked up. So appreciate very much the help on that. But looking really at kind of the neighborhood level improvements, then that big picture around clean energy, and really tonight with Energize East Side, how do we kind of connect from that, from those bigger sources of generation to the street you live on? What's that piece in the middle? And that's really kind of the focus here of Energize East Side. So I'll ask if the clerk can fire up the presentation, that would be great. And I think I probably gave what I have for my title slide and can move in if that's available. And if not, I can talk without pictures too.
Sure. Stand by. I'm going to go grab that in the background.
I spend too much time on live TV not to worry about things that pop up or don't pop up. So that's easy enough.
I was going to, of course, ask, you are indeed Andy Wappler.
I am. I will admit that on days when it's not raining. Yeah, my dad, of course, was around Cairo from the 60s to 2000. And then I did that myself for about 15 years, although I've actually been, give you a little introduction while we're waiting, I've been at Puget Sound Energy for 14 years, since 2008. And in fact, I was hired as we were expanding our Wild Horse Wind facility and open a visitor center there. If you've ever had a chance to go over to the I-90 Wild Horse Wind Farm, which is east of Ellensburg, if you've ever stopped by our visitor center, which I'm told is the only one in the country, and you've read the brochure, that was my first assignment at PSE in 2008, was to write the brochure, which they've since wisely rewritten. But as a longtime weather person, it's been really interesting to me to see the changes in our area. We certainly saw some of that this last year, and I'll talk a bit about kind of what I think that means in terms of weather and climate with what we're trying to do. But here we are, just our introductory page. But if we can advance, I'll show you kind of those 3 topics I was talking about as we were in our introduction. how we can deliver reliable energy for Kenmore and the East Side regionally, enabling that clean energy future and the new technologies that are coming. And in that, I think that means in many cases, new uses for electricity. Vehicles, obviously, probably the most prominent in most of our lives. And then how can we keep leveraging those ongoing neighborhood level system improvements, which again, the city's been so helpful and residents have been helpful in helping us bring to the community. Without the support and the assistance of both those groups, city staff and people in the community, we can't get the job done. So with that, that's kind of our topics here tonight. I'll begin with the biggest picture quickly, which is really that clean energy picture. So on the next slide, these are our goals here going forward, as well as a picture of a wind farm that actually just entered production last week. This is the Golden Hills Wind Farm, which we get the output from. It's in Oregon, and it has enough energy at, I think, 200 megawatts for about 60,000 homes worth of clean power. And great timing. I think it just went into service either the 28th or the 29th of last week. So that's part of what's powering the picture in Kenmore, and part of what's helping us advance on these goals. And thinking back to when I started at PSC in 2008, it was a very big deal that the state had just passed, if you remember, Initiative 937, which was to have 15% of our new energy going forward be from renewables. And now look at the goals. And in 2008, when I would talk to groups in different places, people would ask if 15% was possible. Now we're looking at much bigger goals that I think are possible and achievable. We're looking at 63% clean energy for PSE by 2025, and that's in the plan we just filed with the state of Washington in December, our clean energy implementation plan, which is documentation we have to put forward as to how we're going to meet the state's clean energy goals that came out in 2019 legislation. A big part of that is wind, solar, and batteries, and demand response, which is technology that enables large users and others to dial back at times of peak demand, how those are replacing coal. And coal is out of our portfolio at the end of 2025 by law, and also just by kind of the forces here of obsolescence. And with that, then we'll be carbon neutral by 2030 and carbon free by 2045. And again, when I think about this journey, at least for me, and just broadly for the company, 2008 numbers like this, I think people would have said were impossible. And now here they are. What's interesting in this picture, though, is the picture is wonderful. It shows the new wind farm just opened a week ago. It does, though, in a funny way, as a former meteorologist, point to part of the challenge. If you look at that picture, beautiful picture, there's no wind. If you see fog, you know there's no wind. So yes, it's a great postcard picture of the new wind farm, but it also hints at the challenges. At this moment, there isn't any wind in that picture, but that's part of the reason why this wind farm is in Oregon. Others that we have are the Columbia and Garfield counties, Southeast Washington, and as I mentioned, Wild Horse near Ellensburg. Diversity of location is very important because it gives you a greater chance of having wind on any given day. But really some big strides being taken, and kind of fun that one of them was just last week. Next, really talk a little bit about those local projects in Kenmore that have really, I think, hopefully improved the reliability a good deal. And as I was looking through these two panels, which I know the council saw in a presentation, I believe last September, October, that one of our system planners was able to give 28, I think, different projects here that cover a wide range of things and really address what certainly has been a sore spot in the reliability in Kenmore. Back probably in 2015 or 2016, Councilmember Baker, when I believe he was mayor, we had come an impromptu public meeting in the lobby of City Hall where we were talking about some of the work we were doing. And as people who came from the community to hear about it, we kind of formed a meeting in the round and had an impromptu kind of conversation about reliability. And people wanted to see improvements, which was great. And expectations certainly was more than fair. And I'm glad now we've managed to improve a good deal on those circuits. That was primarily the work then that was being done on the circuit we call Kenmore 26, which if you know your circuit number, that's not a good thing. That tends to mean that you have some problems. And I'm glad we've been able to move past that and fix that. And in these different projects, 28, 30 of them, something like on these two panels, we're looking at a mix of things from what we call tree wire, the coated wire that helps prevent those short outages if just a branch hits a line and shorts things out, to bigger projects like upgrading the substations so that they have new kinds of switching and things and technology, and also on the poles themselves, new technology that enables more rapid switching and bypassing of problems. And I'll note too on here, much of the work is in Kenmore proper. Some of the work, though, is outside of Kenmore, but in, say, Bothell or other places. But the grid doesn't know city limits. And so many cases, we might be doing something outside of the city that actually improves the reliability in the city. And that's certainly true at this neighborhood level. It's really true, too, on the regional level that I'll talk about in a moment with Energize East Side. But again, this work here at the neighborhood level, we appreciate residents who are stepping forward, helping us do the work, and then the city staff and other teams that are helping us actually make it happen at a time when it's busy and there are a lot of projects going on. If I could show, we have a couple pictures actually of some of what this work was that you might be familiar with. One is the substation work I mentioned there in Inglewood, and you wouldn't know it from looking at it, but now it has the new smart switches that are enable faster rerouting of power. So if there is an issue, we can hopefully make a switch and you get a blink instead of an outage. The same thing on the power pole itself, those new generation switches that are faster and smarter. In many cases, I think we think of the smart grid and some of the kind of gadget sorts of things that are there, which are great, maybe enabling solar on your roof or other things. But in a lot of cases, a lot of the benefits going to come from these background pieces that really help reliability and turn what would have been a service call or a trouble call and an outage into something that happens rapid fire. So you get that blink versus an outage. And certainly the last 2 years with the pandemic has really changed expectations about reliability at home, particularly now with remote work and everything else. We simply depend on the grid to be reliable in ways that we didn't even a few years ago. The last, of course, they're from City Hall, electric vehicles. And that's another piece where we get more uses potentially for the electric grid in the future as we begin that move away from fossil fuels in transportation and probably in the built environment as well. Now I'll kind of try and dive into sort of the core of what I was talking about here tonight, which is, as I said, kind of the middle. We had that big picture of, okay, how are we going to generate power? And we're going to generate it more cleanly in the future. And then that neighborhood level, we have to make sure it can get to your house and be reliable. This is the piece in the middle. And I want to mention a couple things about the map here. As you'll no doubt know, Kenmore's not on it at the moment, but it's a really important piece of the grid infrastructure for Kenmore. And I say that because it's interconnected in the grid, and it's much like our economy or other aspects of society. How it performs in one area really benefits people or detriment to people in another if it's not up to snuff. And what we're doing here, and the bottom is Renton, where we have our Talbot Hill substation. The far top end of that black line is our Sammamish substation, which is actually in Redmond and the Willows Road area. That black line shows where we're taking what was a 1960s era power line and upgrading it. If you're electrically knowledgeable, which I didn't know these terms before I came to PSC, so if you don't know them, not a surprise. It has been a 115 kilovolt line for about 60 years. The line was built from 60 to I think 63. It's been a 115 kilovolt line. It's now going to become a 230 kilovolt line. What does that mean? Well, it's simply the ability to deliver more energy. It's a bigger pipe, if you will, to bring more energy to the area and enable us to serve more customers and serve them in a couple ways. When I say growing communities, there's certainly just the population growth we all know on the east side. There's also what I think of as just the growing expectations around reliability, and in some cases the growing, I'll call it pressure on the grid. And I'm thinking now about climate resilience in this case. We've talked about maybe climate change in terms of the clean energy picture, but we know from this last year, we went from temperatures of 110 degrees late last June to 15, 20 degrees by late December, what the National Weather Service at the time called the greatest variation in temperature in our region's history. And so that is placing growing demand on the grid. And if if we looked historically in our area, our peak energy use typically is in the winter on winter mornings. Not surprising. Everybody's getting up. It's dark, it's cold, and all of that. But now I'd say the air conditioners are catching up with the furnaces because we are seeing rapidly increasing summertime energy demand, particularly on the east side. And I think a lot of that is new construction, changing customer expectations for people as they move into multifamily or single family homes, as well as just simply a lot more office space on the east side in general. So we still use our most energy on those cold mornings in December, January, February, but we are seeing new peaks in summertime use in periods like June, July, and August. So it's more punishment on the grid. So it's growth in terms of users. It's also growth in terms of just demands on the system itself. And that helps to mitigate a regional risk, not just in the places where we see the line here, but across the region. And I think the next slide is the one that talks a bit about that, if I remember correctly. Oh, this is what it looks like. So on this page, it gives you a little sense of what's here today. That'd be, of course, the existing, and what will look like in the future. And this is around the Glendale Country Club, which is Bellevue, north of I-90, not far from Bellevue College, if you know that area. And the piece on the left, then, those are the lines that have been built and have been up for about 60 years, those two 115 kilovolt lines. And as you can see in the picture, it's two what I call sort of H-frame wooden structures, each of which has 3 lines on top. In the future, it will look more like it does on the right, with a single pole with those lines together. And when we say a line, it's actually 3 wires because it's 3-phase power. And I'm not enough of an electrical engineer to try to explain that, but line to us is the grouping of wires versus an individual wire. But we'll go from multiple sets of these 2 poles side by side, pairs side by side, to single pole. They are taller, but there are fewer of them, and they are farther apart. That's a good thing, I think, for most of the area. Although, of course, being taller, for some people that may have a view impact. For others, fewer poles may actually improve their view. In citing all of this, which is always challenging, as you know, from working in the public space. We did a lot of outreach beginning in 2014, continued then through the environmental impact statement process in 2015 to 2017, and currently are in the process of the public hearings as we work through permits that are Renton, Newcastle, and Bellevue and Redmond, because these projects are actually cited and permitted at the local level across the area. And that's been happening from 2018 to now 2022. We just completed the Newcastle hearing, and then the North Bellevue hearing is likely later this year. The Redmond hearing comes up in about a month here in June. So that's kind of the what it looks like piece. And then next I want to talk a bit about actually where Kenmore is on the map. So this is the area that's shaded that I know, frankly, is controversial to some people. The reason you're on this map and the reason it's shaded is federal energy requirements, NERC and FERC, which regulate energy on a federal level. We're actually required to have what's called a remedial action scheme, a RAS, or a load shedding scheme, which says if there's a failure in the system, how will you drop load or drop customers, have a rolling blackout, to protect vital equipment from being damaged, with the theory that it's better to have a short outage and protect equipment until you can get things fixed than to have a longer outage that might result in damage to, say, a substation, which might take a long time to get fixed, and probably is particularly a concern today as we're looking at so many different supply chain issues around the area. I think it is extremely unlikely that anything like that would happen, but we're required to have those plans. The alternative, however, is to upgrade the infrastructure, which obviously is what we'd rather do. And what's shown here is the blue line that would be energized east side when it's built. The purple line that's there, interestingly enough, kind of a backwards C shape, that is the existing higher voltage service in the area at 230 kilovolts. By going on energized east side and raising it to that level, we'd have multiple paths of this higher voltage. So in the event of a failure, we have more ability to switch the power and keep the power on. I actually live near that purple line out in the Redmond area, and I'm glad that we can see some progress here in terms of making that connection. Our core usage area is really right up and down 405 from, say, Bothell and Kenmore all the way down to the Renton area. And then next, I believe we have a couple pictures of what's happening today, the work. So construction is underway. The project is being permitted in sort of two phases: south of I-90, which is where these photos are taken, where construction is underway, and then north of I-90, as I mentioned, the Redmond hearing next week, and Bellevue coming up probably later this year. And these are a couple pictures that show the first poles actually being put in the Renton area. I believe they're taken near Renton Technical College, if you're familiar with that part of town. And then some of the work that was done with community outreach and siting and things. The first poles now going in that area in the south end, and then very key substation in the middle in the Bellevue area that's being built. Essentially, the project enables us to feed this central substation, which redistributes the power everywhere, with backup. You have either the north or you have the south. And so in the event that one of those legs fails, you have an alternative. Right now, that existing line doesn't have the capacity to serve that substation with only one side. So if one side were to fail, the substation would go out, and we're in that situation of most of the east side from Issaquah through kind of the 405 corridor up to Kenmore being out of power, which obviously would be a very tough situation. And then I think last was a little bit around some of the information things that we have. This is actually just the front end of the website with some of the news around the city of Newcastle approval. There's a lot on this website, the Energize Eastside website, all of the studies and things that have been done, including a needs study that was done by the city of Bellevue in 2015, all of the documentation through the EIS process, which I think is around 8,000 pages. So a lot of reading there, but a lot of the material, if you're interested, or constituents or others, it's very digestible to read many of the pieces, not necessarily all the pieces in the EIS, but a lot of it is pretty clear if you're interested in knowing more. So with that, I will stop finally and take your questions or your thoughts about this, or just kind of anything that's on your mind related to energy. But appreciate the time, appreciate the support from the city. I know our customers, your residents, people value reliability now more than ever. They also want us to make the energy clean. I think this is how we can make that energy clean and get it to the homes and the businesses that are counting on it.
Councilmember File.
Thank you. Like you mentioned, the newer, taller poles are the future. We have some of those in Kenmore. And of course, with the last several storms, we had seen those poles split or of the issue. And so I'm concerned. We've seen splitting of poles and overburdened poles, breakage with new poles put in. How reliable are these new poles? And I don't have a lot of faith after the last couple storms, after new equipment has been put in.
Well, that's unfortunate. I understand your concerns. We are looking at, these are different poles than the kinds of poles that you're referencing in terms of what we're looking at here are transmission poles that are steel poles set in concrete foundations. They are considerably larger and of a different variety than what you're talking about. I believe the poles you're referencing are neighborhood level poles where we have the local size of delivery line, what we call a feeder, and then neighborhood distribution lines built underneath. And those are typically wood poles. We certainly try to replace those. We have a program to do that under the UTC, but they do face a lot of damage. And they do take a beating out there in the world, as it were. So a little bit different, but I appreciate your concern. And it's part of the reason we appreciate the support from the city to keep going out and keep going with ongoing maintenance programs and everything else. It's always a nuisance for people while we're doing that, or there's flaggers, or we have to do a planned outage to make that work happen. But it's important for the reasons you name.
Well, I appreciate that explanation of difference, but I am still concerned for our community because those kinds of pole breakages that we've had in our community. It's a danger to our community at the time of these storms and to the neighbors that surround them in highly dense areas. So I certainly expect a better, and we certainly expect quality product for what's put in to deliver to our community. And so I expect a safer product moving forward. Thank you.
You bet.
Councilmember Marshall.
So I grew up here in Kenmore, and I am pleased to say that the improvements and the infrastructure investments, I think, have really paid off, at least anecdotally, as we've seen like the last couple years with storms, with the outages not being anything like they used to be. We used to be without power for like a week. It was very, very awful. Can you address vegetation clearing schedules? I think that was part of our agreement that Nancy Owsley diligently, epically worked out. And are we adhering to those? And remind me and the public how often they were, annual, and how we're keeping pace. Thanks, Andy.
Absolutely, and thank you. The statistics are certainly good in terms of the reliability, and they bear out the trend that you're feeling. Reliability has improved consistently, and the vegetation management is key. In terms of the cycle, yes, we're trying to stay on cycle and are. It is not annual though, and an arborist will tell you have to be careful in terms of when you trim what trees, because you don't want to actually damage them and weaken them. And I'm not a gardener, but as I've talked to our arborists over the years, they'll tell me that if you over trim, you can weaken. So depending on the species, typically it's a 2 to 6 year cycle that we go through and trim. And it certainly is important for us. It's, as we all know, it's mid-October through about February. Our ground is wet, the wind blows, and so tree limbs, tree branches, all of that have a very, very big impact on the system. So for us, it's always top of mind. And in addition to that trimming in the vegetation, that's where that tree wire is very handy, so that if the stray limb does come down, it contacts the lines and slips off, but doesn't cause an outage with that coating. So it's both the trimming as well as that hardening of the system that matters.
Any other questions, comments? I would just like to, I'd like to say that as much as I appreciate that I haven't had to empty, throw out my fridge in the last couple of years, it's been refreshing to not have to toss my fridge. And I appreciate the investments that Peterson Energy has made in Kenmore and along Circuit 26. And I'm only saying this because this is your first time at one of these meetings, and I do want you to understand kind of the amount of frustration that Kenmore had with PSC leading up to these changes. And I think you'll appreciate this. The thing that appeared to actually make PSC responsive was not, in fact, the franchise agreement work or any of that. The thing that made PSC responsive was bad press. And that's kind of a disappointing thing from a utility. It took us essentially hiring a PR firm and getting television crews to our council meetings to get a response and action from PSE. And before that, we were having outages. I had a year where I tossed my fridge twice. People were buying generators. That's what people were told to do when they moved to Kenmore, was get a generator. You're going to lose power. And I'm really happy that's not where we are now. I'm very happy that's not where we are now. And I do appreciate all the work that's gone into that. I'm disappointed in how we had to get there eventually, though, or at least the path that we got there. It would have been, I'd be much happier if we had just been able to, if PSC had just, looked at their list, seen the outages we were dealing with and addressed them, or B, not had us go the route of dragging the press into it, because that's not the most fun thing for us or PSC to have had to have dealt with at the time. On the upside, things have gotten much better. We deeply appreciate that. And I think we have a good relationship with PSC now, but it took some work, And so I appreciate you coming here. I appreciate you presenting. Any final questions? I'm not seeing anything. Well, I want to thank you very much for the presentation and for making the time this evening.
Absolutely. And thank you all for your candor and your questions. Appreciate it very much, and appreciate your support and the support of the city staff. And hopefully we can keep on the right trend of all of this and keep delivering clean energy and lights that stay on for your citizens and your community.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we've got the State of Cascadia College presented by Dr. Eric Murray, President of Cascadia College.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
It's interesting to come in as a panelist to a webinar. It takes a minute for the computer to reboot. Hello, everybody. Mayor Herbeck, I missed the introduction because I was joining the panel. Am I good to go?
You are good to go.
All right. Thanks very much. Good evening, Council, Mayor Herbeck, Deputy Mayor O'Kane, council members. Glad to see you all tonight. As you know, I'm Eric Murray, the president of Cascadia College, and I'm here to give a periodic update. Try to make it annual, but it sometimes with the pandemic didn't work out to be quite annual with us on the state of the college. And just by way of background, before we start the couple of slides that I have, Cascadia College has a service district that includes North Shore Schools, Lake Washington Schools, and Riverview Schools, which means that the cities of Kenmore, Bothell, Woodinville, Redmond, and Kirkland all fall within the service district of the college. So although we are located in Bothell, we are your community college. And as you know, I come often, and multiple folks here in this room have intimate ties with Cascadia, whether it be from legislature or consideration of joining our board or past foundation board members. Also, whether you know it or not, we have a current foundation board member by way of your city manager. He's agreed to join us to help us try to find dollars to help support not only students directly, but also to our student support programming that we have at the college. So I wanted to update you a bit on the college and how we've come through the pandemic and where we're at right now and what's on the horizon for the future. So if we can get the slide deck going, that'll guide our conversation.
Sure, stand by.
I can also do it from my...
Do you see what I see?
No, if I'm allowed to share screen, I can also do it from my platform, whichever works best.
Of course, you are, as a panelist, you have that right, but let's try it here so that could be. Do you see what I see?
Now we see
Yep,
it, yeah.
there we go.
Just go ahead
Now
and
let's-
start that.
Okay, do you see the right display or do we need to switch it?
No, that looks good.
That's good.
Perfect.
We can move to the next slide.
Wonderful.
So the pandemic has hit us hard. And before we kind of talk about how we've improved, I think it's important to know that over the last 5 years, especially within the last 2 years, Cascadia's enrollment has declined by about 50%. That means we've gone from about 5,000 students to 2,500 students. And that is a hard hit. And students aren't embracing higher education at the community college level for multiple reasons. One of the biggest, or several of the biggest, are that there's a lot of insecurity around finances. Is my job going to be stable? Will I still have a job? Then there came in a lot of other insecurities about what am I going to do with my child? Do I need to be home while they're at home? And do I have time to go to school? And so folks had a lot of insecurity about going into higher ed. And across the nation, most community colleges are between 30 and 40% down in enrollment. Even the universities are now down 5 to 7%. I think UW-Bothell is 7% down because of this unsure attitude people have about what to do next. And so that hits Cascadia hard to the tune of about $3 million. And we still have some stimulus money remaining. Financially, we're very stable and we have reserves to help get us through this time when students are starting to return. But during the time, we've also thought about how we can make the college more responsive to our community. And so I wanted to share a few of those things with you. We are adding new academic programs. So the legislature this year, for the first time ever, has given us authority to offer running start or college classes for high school students during the summer. Previously, that was restricted to only the academic K through 12 school year. We have an American Indian and Indigenous Studies new degree that we've just created, which is one of only a couple in the entire nation. And the legislature has authorized us to start offering bachelor's degrees in computer science because of the high demand, and the universities can't keep up with that. So those are all coming to Cascadia. We are at the top end of our service district in Bothell and Kenmore, and we have decided to open up a new site, a satellite site in Redmond, in something called the Together Center, which houses 20 different nonprofits below 6 stories of affordable housing. And Cascadia will have a classroom there, and we'll be offering courses for those folks who are served by those nonprofits, as well as running start classes for that area. Amazon has helped us by giving us a startup grant to get that going. We are implementing something called Guided Pathways, which is a new way of thinking about how we map out degree pathways to universities. It gives students the opportunity to study in meta majors rather than specific majors, so they have flexibility when they get to their junior year. It also really focuses on making sure students who have hurdles and who are underrepresented can get through higher education. And we are implementing 2 customer relation management tools, which we've never had before, which include tracking students from our very first contact with them through enrollment. Also from once they've enrolled, then it tracks them through completion, transfer, or degree. Next slide, please. A few other things that we're doing. For the first time ever, we've established academic pathways from UW Bothell. You might think that that was already in existence or a slam dunk, but previous to this year, leadership at UW Bothell tried to find an identity distinct from UW Seattle and distinct from Cascadia, and this was never on their agenda. The new chancellor has said that UW Bothell is all about making sure that Cascadia students can get into UW Bothell. They have about a 90% chance of getting in if they come from Cascadia, as opposed to a 25% chance of getting in originally from UW. And with that said, UW for the first time ever is now referring students to Cascadia to come if they can't admit them first off as freshmen. We have a new building under construction for science, technology, engineering, math, and it's a joint building with the University of Washington. That's the first one of these in the nation. And our faculty will work side by side. Our students will study not just on the same campus, but in the same building and classrooms next to each other. We've been authorized by the legislature for a new Cascadia College 5 building, which is going to be called our Gateway Building, and that takes care of all enrollment needs for a student if they visit campus, so we can get them into classes. And then you may also know that UW Bothell has been authorized to build 1,000 student residential village in the Bothell area. So we'll see a large number of students living on campus in housing starting in a year and a half. Next slide. The college will continue to offer in-person, hybrid, and remote learning opportunity more so than we ever did pre-COVID. As you know, we all went to remote during COVID. This year, we've been in kind of a mix, and we will continue a mix next year, but we will have a lot more in-person and kind of bring back the vitality to campus. We did not let go of faculty or staff during the pandemic. A lot of our other neighboring colleges did so, but our trustees, because we were in a good financial place, decided to keep fully staffed so that we could be ready for the return. Our facilities are all open, and even to date, we are still the most successful transfer institution in the state, meaning we're most successful getting students from a community college into a university, which was really why we were designed. So we are ready for those students to return. Next slide. And I think we can conclude, go ahead and conclude the slide deck. We are ready for students. We are financially stable, and but that being said, we really could use another 750 students so that we don't have to keep dipping into our reserves in order to make ends meet. And we hope that we're doing the right things, the right enrollment initiatives to get students to us. As an example of one of our enrollment initiatives, we just offered the North Shore School District a Student of Color Conference. That's what we called it. They called it a Student Justice Conference. Over 200 students came from North Shore School District and spent the day with us being exposed to Cascadia. And we're doing the same for Lake Washington School District. Riverview got word of it. They want us to do one for them. And even a school district outside of our service area in Lake Stevens got wind of it and said, we want to send a whole bunch of students to you for the same kind of thing. So we are trying to reach out and make sure that we explore equity and inclusion issues, that we make sure we're a welcoming place, that we get students to UW, that we open a satellite easily accessible center in Redmond. So there are a lot of bold initiatives that we're taking to help turn around those student numbers. But any help that we can get would be greatly appreciated with that. I would also like to say our foundation, which supports student scholarships and programming that Rob joined, we are looking to go from 7 members now up to 15 members. We're ready to start doing some fundraising and campaigns. So if you all have any interest or know of people who are looking to serve the community, would be happy to entertain them coming to work on behalf of Cascadia to help students succeed. So I offer that out to you as well, and I'm happy to take questions.
Questions, comments? Councilmember Marshall and then Councilmember File.
When does computer science start again?
Well, we already have a couple of 2-year programs in place and a 4-year program in mobile application development. But the BS, the bachelor's degree in computer science, we're looking to open a year from now.
Councilmember File.
Thank you. Cascadia is a wonderful community college that serves our community well. And I'm very excited to hear that you're going to be taking on bachelor's programs and getting more competitive that way. One of the things I do hear from some families and students that choose a different pathway, like LW Tech, for example, and in their bachelor programs or their connector programs, is some of the those fees just getting started. That can be difficult for families, that struggle a little bit more. So Cascadia is one of the colleges that has, testing fees and fees, a number of fees that can be hard for families to accommodate. Are there any equitable pathways you have to resolve that issue, or are you going to start addressing that issue?
Well, Cascadia did away with our application fee a couple years ago, so that no longer is a barrier for students. We do not pass along any fees that profit the college. They're all when there are third parties asking us to be charged for things. That being said, it's one of the roles of our foundation is if we have a student in need and our dean of students can make this call, all they have to do is come to us and say, this is a barrier for me. We find the money to make it happen for students. So it's not a blanket waiver, but we definitely on a case-by-case basis will take care of students who need it. So they just need to be referred. And if you've got a family in need, you can as much give them my email as anyone else's, and I'll be happy to work with them.
Very good. Thank you.
Councilmember Kugler.
Thank you, President Murray. Thank you so much for coming and giving us the update. I think the Together Center initiative sounds really, really awesome for the community. And I know I'm familiar with the project that's going on there. I think that's going to be a great resource. Will people be able to earn degrees there or take more of like certificate courses or individual like continuing ed or all of the above?
Yeah, we're spending this summer designing the academic program since it's not actually physically constructed and ready to open until March 2023. So we will be taking some time to think about the programming. What I have in mind so far, my vision is we need to offer running start classes because those are actually high profit classes for us, which will allow us to continue to pay for the center. But we want to balance that with our not-for-profit classes, which is English as a second language and GED studies. By virtue of our relationship with Amazon, they also want us to make sure that we are offering computer science and computer tech introductory classes. And when those students enroll, we will work with them to see if a degree pathway for them in computer science is possible. So I know those are the 3 domains up front. A comprehensive program, I don't know yet if we can offer, it's one classroom of 24 that'll be open probably 7 days a week from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. So it just depends on how we can fulfill the programming needs.
I have a couple follow-up questions, if that's okay. Awesome, that's really exciting. Thank you for explaining what might be going on there. I also just wanted to share a comment. I think it's great that you have a UW transfer pathway now in place. I think that's going to be such a great, I guess, help assure local families, you know, a better pathway for them into that. So I think that's wonderful. And also having friends who work over at Cascadia College, I just want to say, I know they've been really impressed with your steady leadership and during this time. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Any other questions, comments? Well, as always, we really appreciate the update and appreciate having you as a partner in the community.
You are my favorite city council, by the way. I probably shouldn't say this, but we have such this intimate relationship, and we're small entities, and we're fighting the big dogs sometimes. And Kenmore has always stepped up to be a supporter of Cascadia, sometimes even more so than Bothell. With the new city council, I hope that tide is turning a little bit. So I just adore Kenmore, and I live right next door in Lake Forest Park. Those things don't have to go in the minutes, but I just want to say I love coming to your council every time.
I'm calling Mayor Thompson as soon as this meeting's done.
Well, Mason is turning the tide, I think. I adore him as well. So.
Mr. City Manager?
Well, what I loved about Eric is he walks the talk. He's very involved in the community, and he's been a chair of the president of the chamber, and he MCs as a lot of things with no fee. Like he runs the candidate forums, as you know, and he's we have a great tradition of him being the MC at the State of the City every year, and so he's a great friend, and it's been good being his colleague all these years. Eric, when did you start at Cascadia? How long ago?
I'm finishing my 12th year, so I think right before you started. And I think at that time, Councilmember Marshall was on our foundation board, I think. So again, there's these intimate, Councilmember Kugler and I have had lots of different kinds of interactions, the same Mayor Herbeck. So there's lots of intimate ties here that really make it a good partnership, and a lot of mutual love there, I think. So.
Thank you.
No, we appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. All right, next on our agenda is a study session, Open Public Meetings Act training and discussion with Morgan Damerow from the Office of the Attorney General. And I apologize if I mangled your name.
Well, you know, since I didn't actually hear my name while the system was rebooting, I'll say you got it perfect.
Fantastic.
And let me find start my video here as well. There we go. That up a little bit so I don't see the top of my head. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to spend some time with you this evening talking about the Open Public Meetings Act. Just in terms of, you know, I've actually appreciated being the third thing on the agenda. I actually grew up in Kenmore and still have family up that way. And I was hoping we'd get to do this in person this evening because it would be a good excuse to see family and whatnot. But, you know, that's not where we are yet. So be it.
I'll be there next month after because of the governor's order. So
yeah, so yep, we should have pushed this off a month, but well, it's not where we are now. So let me do one more thing. Let me share my screen here, and that you should also be able to see it now. And great. So anyways, in terms of introductions, you know, yes, you got my name exactly right. And the reason I get to talk with you this evening is because of what I do with the AG's office. I'm our lead attorney for our public records consultation program, meaning that I work with local governments all over the state on transparency issues. Since 2018, that's been the Public Records Act. Since one of our colleagues retired about a year and a half ago, talking with folks about the OPMA was added to the things I get to do. And I'm kind of weird in this way. I like these transparency issues. I like public records. People always look at me like there's got to be something wrong with me. I had the same feelings about the OPMA, just in terms of what it does and, you know, what its purpose is. But basically, in terms of, that's why I was asked to come speak with you tonight. And in terms of big picture wise, If there's anything we can do to help you with public records, that's why Lucy's with us. That's why I have this job. We are a service for folks. Where we're going to go this evening is we're going to talk a little bit big picture wise about the importance of open government and transparency. And obviously the bulk of our conversation this evening is going to be talking about the Open Public Meetings Act. Unlike the last two presentations, I'd like to invite you to do something a little bit different and interrupt me as we go along, ask questions. Don't feel like you have to hold them to the end. I think it makes for just a better conversation as we talk versus having to go back and refresh where we were and things like that. So by all means, feel free to just chime in at any time and we'll talk about those issues. Of course, I also need to give some kind of a disclaimer because I think if I didn't, I'd get a letter from the Bar Association or something like that about, the purpose of this evening's conversation is to give you, information and education about the OPMA, really to help you issue spot and whatnot. Because, the OPMA changed over time, and we're going to talk about a lot of those changes tonight. The legislature this last session made a number of changes to the OPMA. So the timing of this discussion here this evening is perfect. And then, of course, we have litigation that enhances our knowledge of the OPMA at times and what's expected, which is really why it's important to go through training every once in a while. By statute, it has to be every 4 years. Within 90 days of you taking office, and then every 4 years after that. But obviously, I recommend you do it a little more frequently just to keep up to speed with things. And then, of course, one of the best things you can do is take advantage of your legal counsel, talk with them about issues and whatnot. It really can help you along the way. So, why part of this is self-explanatory. The idea of training, it's your path through the woods. It's your ability to get from where you are to where you want to be without stumbling off the trail, without ending up in the brambles or the blackberry bushes and whatnot. And the other good reason to do it is that the courts, if you do happen to run afoul of something, whether it's PRA or PMA, either one of these transparency laws, the courts will look at where is the agency in terms of this culpability. And part of what training does is helps show that the city is responsible when it comes to these transparency laws, both the OPMA and the PRA. And that, if there is an issue, that the issue was a decision moment or an oops kind of moment, and not the moment of, this is just not something we take seriously. So, that's obviously one good reason as to why training is important. Some of the good reasons that I really like this quote from Justice Brandeis about sunlight being the best disinfectant. And if you look at people that are looking at city government, at the state level, wherever the issue may be, a lot of times it's because they're questioning what's going on. They want to know, why is this decision being made? And in the absence of good information, a lot of that comes from the OPMA, being able to watch those decisions being made. They'll start filling in those kind of, oh, this is because this is benefiting council member X's brother or sister or something like that. And so being able to watch all this process really kind of helps. And then there's, and I think Mayor Herberg, you had a good point in terms of with your conversation with Mr. Wappler about the impacts the media can have, and think about what happens when the public starts seeing your city of Kenmore in a newspaper article talking about violating these laws. It causes that kind of issue to arise in people's head about, wow, what are they hiding? What are they? What else are they doing wrong? And think about the impact that has on just the perception of what the city is doing. So this is kind of all running in the background, and this is why the transparency laws are so important. Bottom line is that folks may not agree with the decisions that you make as council, but obviously you're elected to make those decisions. But disagreeing with the decision is far different than not understanding how you got there, and that's really what these laws are designed to address. So with that, we're going to jump into our conversation about the Open Public Meetings Act. And like I said, this includes some changes that just came online, some March 24th, and then some that are happening on June 9th. And as Mayor Herberg mentioned, also on June 1st, we have another shift in what we're doing with public meetings because of the Proclamation 2028-16. So we're going to talk about all of these things here over the next half hour or so. So big picture wise, what the purpose of the OPMA is, like I said, to let the public see the decision-making process. And that's the decision-making process, not just the final vote, the final action, and we'll talk about that, but it's from start to finish. It's from gavel to gavel to see the discussions that you have in terms of, where do we stand on this issue? Understand how you got there. And that's, this is this is actually from the Supreme Court. That's their identified purpose of the OPMA. And that, you'll see that language if you read the OPMA, the first couple of sections of it, you'll see this exact idea mirrored. And if you look at the recent amendments at this last session, this was the driving force behind a lot of what we're going to be talking about change-wise. So in terms of who the OPMA applies to, it applies to the governing body of a public agency. And that's probably not super surprising. Obviously, you're the council for the city of Kenmore. You're the governing body. Obviously, Kenmore is a public agency. And it gives, that's who it applies to. So let's talk a little bit more about what a governing body is. Part of it, I think, what you would expect. It is the council like you, that rulemaking governing body that makes decisions. But it can go further than that. It can be a subcommittee. So if you would create a planning commission, and they had delegated authority, they would have, they're subject to the OPMA. If they basically act on your behalf, if they conduct a hearing on your behalf, if they're taking testimony or public comment, all of those kinds of actions beyond what just you're doing could be subject to the OPMA. So it's always something to keep in mind. My experience has been that city councils are usually, they've got this, they know it, they expect it. It's some of the boards and commissions that when they're first forming, they start to realize, oh, okay, we've got to do these additional things. But it's something to keep in mind just to let a foundation for you. Big picture wise, and just to give you a picture of who's subject to the OPMA, it's any agency. And this is statewide. This is at the state level, boards, commissions, departments. At the local level, it's school districts, city councils, special purpose districts, municipal corporations like PUDs and things like that. There's some unusual ones out there that are subject to it if they're created by statute, by an ordinance or something like that. And then there's some very unique ones for public utilities that have power generation and things like that. So, but it's a very expansive law in terms of who it applies to, who the definition of an agency is. One common question that comes up is, what about my homeowners association? They're not doing any of these things. And the homeowners associations, they're not agencies of the state. That's between you and your neighbors in a contract. But I get lots of phone calls now from people asking me questions about, my board has done this or my homeowner HOA has done this. And so I wanted to kind of bring that up with you. So now we know what governing body is, we know what an agency is. So then there has to be a meeting. And a meeting is, and sounds a little bit redundant, but a meeting is a meeting at which action takes place. And so we'll talk about what action is in a minute. But in order to satisfy that there's a meeting, there has to be a quorum of you present. So for the city council, I believe there are five council members, if I remember correctly. So if there was 3 of you, you've got a quorum. And present isn't required. So you don't actually have to physically be at the same.
7 of it.
Oh, 7, thank you. The city doesn't have to, you all don't have to be at the same place. A meeting can occur by phone. Obviously, in the last 2 years, we've been holding meetings this way. And I know the city council has been doing it. We're doing it again this evening. Also, the title doesn't matter, whether you call it a meeting, whether you call it a retreat, a study session. What the courts really look at is, what's the function? What's going on? Is the council meeting and taking action? Are you acting in your official capacity? Are you doing something to the benefit of your agency? That doesn't mean that, if one of you sends an email to everybody else saying, hey, here's some information for the next meeting, that is a meeting. You can always receive information without comment. That's not a meeting. You always need to be careful with that because it's really easy to hit the reply button, or even worse, the respond all button. And there's a lot of agencies that inadvertently step over the line to that dreaded respond all button. If I could change one thing in Microsoft Outlook or any of the programs, I would make that respond all button go away, because I don't think any good comes from the respond all button. It just causes records issues and whatnot. But just be really careful when you get emails if you're responding and things like that. So let's talk a little bit about what action is, just to kind of finish out the idea of when a public meeting happens. So like I said from the beginning, it's not just that final vote, it's the gavel to gavel of what's going on. So if you're taking public testimony, it's all the discussions. When you're having that discussion, the considerations, evaluations, all of that comes into when you're taking action. And this is one of the things that differentiates where we are now with the OPMA versus 1971. Prior to 1971, all the OPMA guaranteed was the ability to see the final action, that final vote. And it's part of what we saw coming out of Watergate and all, out of the 60s. This desire and this need to be able to watch what's going on triggered this expansion of the OPMA, both here in Washington and across the nation, and whatnot. So let's compare that with, action, big picture versus final action. And the final action is that decision-making point. And this has become more important now with some of the changes that have come into play with the Open Public Meetings Act. But final action is that decision-making process, whether positive or negative, doesn't matter. It's, where do you stand on this issue? And that has to be done in open session. Even if deliberations were happening in a closed session or an executive session, we'll talk about those in a second, you still have to come back to open session for the actual decision-making process. The people have the right per the OPMA to see how you vote, to see, are you voting yes or no on whatever issue you're dealing with at the time. And secret ballots are not allowed. What that means is you can't send emails to, okay, are we all in agreement here? Or if you're in executive session, say, okay, do we have an agreement? So when you back into public session, that basically the die has been cast. Obviously, you can have conversations in executive session, but you can't get to that decision point. You have to have that frank conversation, then come back out for, this is how I'm going to vote. So let's talk a little bit about, now that we have the world set in terms of what a public meeting is from your perspective, let's talk a little bit about it from the perspective of the public. So if you went and looked at the OPMA a couple of years ago, it'd be very different than what we're dealing with now. You can't place conditions on the public to be able to attend a public session. What that means is that, people have the ability to walk into council sessions when they're open, when we're back in person, and sit down in the back of the room and to be able to watch the proceedings. You can't have them generally have sign-ins. You can't have that be a condition. You can't create barriers for them watching the sessions. Part of what comes up is you can't set reasonable rules of conduct. That doesn't mean it's the wild, wild west. And some of the changes we saw in the OPMA this time confirm that you don't have to accept disruptive comment or disruptive conduct by people. One thing that commonly happens is that folks will, in the back of the room will, and where we are today with technology is they will pick up their phone and they'll just be holding it up for the longest time and they'll be recording the sessions. These are public meetings. That's okay. While Washington is a two-party consent state, those are for private conversations. And so, if people are being respectful, as long as they're not like rushing counsel up to the table, like up the dais or something like that, if they're putting their phone right in your face and saying, "How can you do that? How can you say that?" That's a whole separate issue. But if they're conducting themselves well, those kinds of things are okay. Like I said, some of the revisions from this last session do let us set some reasonable applicable guidelines for protection of public health, to protect against interruptions. And a lot of this, I think, came out of what we saw with the governor's proclamations, when there were the requirements for things like masking, or there's a few horror stories from the state about interruptions happening in public meetings around things like masks and things like that. And so the legislature has codified our ability to put some rules in place. The other thing that has happened in this last session is that, kind of a continuation of what we've been doing for the last 2 years is, while it's not required, there's a strong encouragement in the OPMA now to provide alternate means of access, things like telephonic or internet or something like that. Some agencies have the ability to broadcast through local cable television. I know of a couple jurisdictions that actually have access to a local radio station and they broadcast all their meetings. That's an encouragement now in the OPMA. And obviously, I think this is bearing itself out. A lot of folks I've spoken with over the last 2 years have seen an uptick in public participation because of the fact that they can do exactly what we're doing here tonight. While I'm in my office this evening, I've participated in other public meetings having to do with my local school board and things like that, while I'm sitting at my kitchen counter cutting carrots to make dinner and things like that. So I think this is partially what I think the legislature has seen this uptick, and they want to encourage that kind of growth because of the transparency it comes from. Another big change that we got this year is public comment. If it was 6 months ago and the question was, and people commonly ask me about, my city council, my county council, they didn't let me make a comment and have to explain to them that they don't have to. Obviously, a lot of city councils, a lot of county councils have been doing it for a long time, but now it's required under the OPMA. Prior to taking final action at a regular meeting, you are now required to take public comment through one of two ways. Either oral comment, like the city of Kenmore I think has been doing, where people can, basically sign up and say, I want to make a comment on something the board is considering or something I want the council to be aware of. Again, you can put reasonable restrictions in place, things like time limits, asking people to sign up, things like that. One of the also requirements is that if you're going to take oral public comment, you have to basically accommodate folks that can't get there. So think about people that are mobility impaired or disabilities, or the way it's phrased within the statute is they would have difficulty attending the meeting in person. And I'm not quite sure what exactly that means, but unless it's basically, if feasible, unless it's not feasible, you need to be doing that. And I know that's one of the things the city of Kenmore is working on to make sure that it continues that transparency. But as you're working forward on, if you decide to accept oral comments, that's something you're going to have to do. The other option you have is written comment, and again, you can establish some reasonable guidelines as to when that written comment has to be submitted. How far in advance of the meeting. One specific requirement is that if you accept written comment, it has to be distributed to the council members. So one good thing to put in we'll talk about minutes in just a second, but this would be one good thing to put in those council meeting minutes, is that we accepted written comment and we received 15 comments, and those were distributed to all the council members at 9 o'clock this morning or something like that. Make sure it's recorded, just to prove that you're doing it right. One kind of repercussion of this that agencies are kind of wrestling with is you have to accept or is when to take oral comment, when to take written comment. Obviously, if it's happening before the meeting, that's easy. But if you're taking oral comment at some point during the meeting, how are you going to structure that? Because it has to be prior to taking any final action. I've had a lot of conversations with folks about some kind of apparently simple ideas, but one of them was, when do we have to take oral? Do we have to take oral comment for things like approving of minutes? Because what I've seen, or approving of the agenda. And I've seen some agencies wrestle with that question because that's usually the first and second thing that comes up, maybe before they take oral comment. So some agencies are rearranging their pattern of things. So it's things that you have to work through now that we have this mandatory comment period. I mentioned it a minute ago that one of the things that you should put in your minutes is, if you get written comment, that you should make that available to, you should record how that's distributed to your council members. Pardon me, my screen just decided to glitch for a second here. There we go. What's interesting about the OPMA is, with a couple of exceptions, there's no specific format that's required for those. And I've seen some OPMA minutes that are amazingly detailed, that read almost like transcripts. And I always feel sorry for the clerk of the boards when I read those, because they must just be either writing or typing just feverishly and trying to get it right. And then I've seen some other minutes that are incredibly cryptic, and it's tough to understand that there was actually anybody present. Our office has advocated for more of a middle ground position where you're recording what the key decision points are and things like that. But this is something, each board and each council kind of develops their own kind of flavor. But think about the idea. You want to be able to kind of tell, what happened. There are a couple of exceptions now. Well, there's the recommendation I have in terms of recording the distribution of the written comments. The other one that's required now in those minutes is, if you go into an executive session, the purpose of that executive session has to be recorded. I don't think that's a big change, quite honestly. I think most boards that I saw, and most boards I worked with over my time with the AG's office, which is, it's been about 20 years now, that's been a pretty common practice as we go in and whatnot. But it's now specifically in the law. Another good practice is that in the minutes you put in the participation information. If you have remote participation, what were the participation opportunities? Was it telephonic? Was it through some kind of an internet-based Zoom or GoTo or Teams or something like that? Just in terms of proving that it works, how many participants did you have, either viewing the session remotely, just to prove that it was working, things like that. One of the things that we've seen is kind of this growth in the OPMA and the policy provisions within the new changes is that while agencies aren't required to continue to broadcast the events, obviously we'll talk about some specific if there's an emergency situation in a minute. But in general periods, say we went forward in time 2 years, life is back to what we knew. There's no, as of right now, there's no specific requirement in the OPMA that you continue to stream, but there's a strong encouragement. And it's for the ideas and for the purposes I was talking about earlier, where, if you think about the impacts it has, the ability of folks to sit at home and watch, and, there's always a barrier. If I have to get in my car, drive to city council, what am I going to do with my kid? Those kinds of issues. So it really does have some good underlying purposes. They're also encouraging agencies to record and to make those recording available for 6 months online. It doesn't alter any of the record keeping requirements. And specifically the statute says under 4256, and it's actually, that's the Public Records Act. The records retentions are a different statute, but what they're talking about is that, the records retention periods don't change. But again, this is the more you make available to folks, the ability to go back and watch prior meetings. And I've done this with past council meetings. I've done it with one of the City of Kenmore ones. I've done it with the City of Bothell, where I've gone back, City of Woodinville, where I've gone back and watch meetings to answer a question that I've gotten from a member of the public. And it just really helps kind of explain and helps people understand what it is that you're doing and not have things be lost in the past and whatnot. It doesn't take the place of the minutes. The minutes are the official record, but this is a recommendation that the legislature is expecting if we can do it. Let's talk a little bit about interruptions and disruptions. One thing that we got from this last modification of the OPMA was some very specific language in the OPMA that the boards, commissions are able to stop folks from speaking when not recognized. It goes back to the idea of, this is your meeting, you have the ability to control it. And while, in adding, I think it was a balancing between adding the required public comment, they also didn't want it to become a free-for-all. And so they codified for us that, you can ask people to hold on a minute, we'll get to you in a minute. And if they don't, then this is where the disruptions and interruptions comes into place. In the OPMA is a specific hierarchy for dealing with interruptions and disruptions. And it starts with where you would expect, and you try to deal with the person that is, if it's a single person, that is being disruptive, or the group of people that is being disruptive, asking them to, please stop, or asking them to leave, and then escalating from there to where you can clear the council chambers. Or if that doesn't work, where you can actually adjourn the meeting from this location and reconvene in a different location. There's been some specific processes that you have to follow in terms of motions and things like that. And so, talk with your attorney about those kinds of processes. But you do have that ability to deal with interruptions and disruptions. One of the things that I talk with city clerks, I typically ask is, look at your binder for city council meetings. It's one of the back 3 tabs you have something that is the checklist for how to deal with disruptions and interruptions. You should have that kind of waiting. Hopefully you never have to use it, but that way, if it happens, then the clerk or the mayor has that readily available and and knows the process and doesn't get caught flat-footed. So now we've talked about kind of what, when meetings happen, your obligations. We've talked about some of the public interaction. So let's drill a little bit deeper and let's talk about meetings themselves. And we're going to talk about meetings, and there's 2 or 3 different kinds of meetings depending upon how you want to slice this. The first one is the regular meetings. And these are the meetings that happen according to schedule. For state agencies, these are published in the WACs. For local governments like the City of Kenmore, these happen because they're by resolution, your bylaws. They say that we will meet the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Mondays of the month, or that kind of schedule. And so people know when to expect them. So those are the regular meetings. You have some very specific requirements for them. You have to have that agenda available available online at least 24 hours in advance. There are some exceptions for very small agencies. The City of Kenmore doesn't qualify for those. So you're too large. But you do. So you do have that up on your website 24 hours in advance. The nice thing about the agenda is, it's published. It gives folks a chance to understand what you're going to talk about at your regular meetings. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing you can talk about. You can modify that agenda. Typically, the way that happens historically has been, one of the council members will make a motion. There'll be a motion to approve the agenda, and then there'll be a subsequent motion before that passes to add agenda item 4B or something like that. You can do that. You're not tied to have that your agenda be what was published 24 hours in advance. The other nice thing with that is that if you get your agenda wrong, that doesn't mean it is any action you take is dead in the water. If you take action at a regular meeting, even if it wasn't posted 24-hour advance, that doesn't mean it can be overturned. That doesn't mean they're going to be able to get attorney's fees. That's specifically written into the statute. But having said that, I've yet to see an agency that uses that as some kind of a tool. Most agencies, I don't think Kenmore is any different, really does their best to get their agendas out 24 hours in advance, because it really does help the public know what's going on. Should I come to the meeting or should I not? And every once in a while, I'll see my boards, my commissions, when I had them directly, would ask about adding an item. I'm like, yeah, we can do that. And then when we start talking about adding lots and lots of items, I'd have the conversation about, we can do this, but let's think about the optics of it. I encourage folks to really think about, is it something is that pressing, or can we schedule a special meeting to deal with those issues, or can it be kicked to the next agenda? And it's not a legal issue necessarily, but it's more of the impact it'll have on the community if the agenda that's dealt with is far different than what you said you were going to deal with. Because there are folks in the community that will be convinced that there'll be conspiracy theorists or think the city is trying to hide something. My experience is that's not the case, but it's always something you kind of have to think about. So the other major type of meeting is what we're doing here this evening. It's a special meeting, and that can be called by the chair of the board or by a majority of the board members. It does have some very specific requirements in terms of what how folks are supposed to get notice of those meetings. You have to give meeting, much like we saw with regular meetings, 24 hours in advance. It has to be written. It has to have the time, the place, the business to be transacted. So basically the agenda. We do have an exception. We'll be talking in a minute about some of if there's a state of emergency or something like that, but we do now have an exception to posting these special meetings when it can't be posted with reasonable safety. Looking historically at what the courts have looked like for safety issues and emergency situations, I think this is likely to be a higher burden. It was raining a lot. That's not going to be an emergency. It's going to be things like 2 years ago now, when the town of Malden was facing wildfires. That's the kind of emergency. Reasonable safety is going to be that kind of a thing. Maybe not quite to that level, but it's going to be not necessarily the lowest burden. It has to be given to each member of the governing body, and you can waive it by attending. If you have a local newspaper of general circulation, so there used to be the North Shore Citizen, the Seattle Times, if they had a standing request with you on file to get copies of the special meetings, or those announcements, you'd have to give it to them. We don't see a lot of this anymore. Some jurisdictions in Eastern Washington that have a local newspaper still. Most media is more watching websites and things like that now, but it is something to watch for. Again, it has to be posted on your agency's website unless you don't have a website, and then it has to be prominently displayed at your main entrance of your principal location. So it's the city hall on its door, and at the place where you're going to have that meeting. So let's say you're expecting a very large audience, and so you're going to use one of the high school gyms or something like that. You need to post it there as well. There is an exception. You don't for special meetings if they're going to be all remote, then, or if they're going to be remote meetings, you don't have to post it at the place they're going to be held, because obviously, it doesn't exist. But you still do need to do your best to get that notice out, at least by putting it up on your website. There is a third kind of meeting, and in my 20 years of advising boards and commissions, I've never done one of these. There can be emergency meetings. They're actually a subset of special meetings.
Actually, can I ask you a quick question on special meetings before we move on?
Of course.
I've always thought it's funny because with special meetings, the agenda can't be amended, and yet we still have to approve the agenda. Is that something that we actually need to be doing, or is the agenda assumed approved because we can't amend it?
Oh, good point. I'm glad you brought that up. I meant to mention something about that. The other thing that makes regular meetings different from special meetings is at a regular meeting, you can put something on the agenda put it through to final action. You can't do that on special meetings. And while you are maybe able to add something to the agenda to have a conversation, you can't make a final decision on it. That's what makes them different. Most of my boards and commissions don't even add things to special meetings. They stick with what they've got because they're there to deal with an issue. And typically the special meetings I've had have either been like this, where it's a study session type of thing, or we're meeting for a special meeting to deal with a specific issue, to authorize an investigation, or to deal with something like that. So there is that distinction between them.
Okay, thank you.
So about, a quick comment about emergency meetings. Like I said, in 20 years, I've never done one of these. The town of Malden would have qualified for one of these if they would have had to do something when the wildfires were approaching, because that involves obviously potential for serious injury, damage to property, things like that. And that's why, I chose the pictures I did. Mount St. Helens erupting, wildfires, a dam breaking, where if you don't take action right now, we're going to have loss of life, loss of property in a significant way. The few times this has been before the courts have set this at a very high standard. And even things with labor disputes, the courts have said that's not sufficient. Tell me, it may not have been convenient, but this could have waited 24 hours and things like that. And it's kind of what you expect. It forgoes all the notice of announcements because the council has to meet right now to make a decision to hire a contractor, to help build a levee, to do something, whatever the case may be, to bring in water tankers, and we need to do this right now or else. My suspicion is that when you're facing the wildfires, these things just happen, and then they're dealt with after the fact. But in some situations, I could see that the city council would have to meet for specific reasons to authorize expenditures or something like that. So new this year is this idea of remote meetings. And this is kind of an outgrowth of what we saw from Proclamation 2028. Obviously, we've been doing remote meetings for going on 2 years now. And as we see the Proclamation 2028 going away in about two and a half weeks here, there is the option to continue those. In the event that there's a need. So when is there going to be a need? So there's a need when there's a declared emergency. So that could be at the local level, the state level, or at the federal level. And then the agency also has to make a determination that it can't hold an in-person meeting with reasonable safety for members of the public or the governing body in attendance. If you're going to do that, then going kind of back to where we are right now, you still have to create these other opportunities for people to be able to participate remotely. Things like telephonic or internet or things like that. And again, and this is also if you are making these decisions, if you are facing an emergency and you follow the first two, you also on the notice of the meeting have to include information about how remote participation is going to be accommodated. What's the website link? What is the dial-in phone numbers? Things like that. If you satisfy those requirements, you have two options of how to hold that emergency meeting. One is you can hold a completely remote meeting where nobody is sitting in the same place. We're doing much like we've been doing for the last 2 years, where everybody is sitting someplace by themselves in their house or whatnot and participating, or making this a little bit different than what we saw with the proclamation. The governing body can elect to hold a meeting with the governing body present at one location, but some or all of the members of the public excluded. And this was something people really wrestled with for the last 2 years, and so the legislature has made some choices to give that tool to local governments and to the state agency subject to the OPMA, that you can do just the governing body present and basically broadcast it to everybody else, which is I think part of the reason why they had such strong language about the public being able to listen through some kind of a remote tool. They also added something or clarified something that has also been happening for a lot of time. In non-emergency times, that members of the, say in this evening, a couple of council members couldn't be here. If they were able to participate remotely, that's specifically authorized now. So they could be on vacation in Hawaii and decide to take a couple hours off to do a council meeting and hopefully not turn their web cameras on because that would just be cruel and that kind of a thing. But it's also specifically authorized this idea that remote meetings can continue.
Does that require cities to allow members to participate remotely, or does that just allow cities to allow members to participate remotely?
It's permissive. It says that they may.
Okay.
It doesn't there's no mandate language that I see in the statute that I can recall. I recommend double check with your attorney to make sure that my memory isn't faulty, but I believe it's permissive.
Okay, thank you.
And Mayor Herbig, you mentioned this already, but we've been working with Proclamation 2028. It was 15 and now 16 for a lot of months now. And the only thing I'm going to say about this is that come June 1st, Proclamation 2028 is ending, which means that it's the suspensions that we've saw within Proclamation 2028 about conducting in-person meetings is prohibited unless you go through certain requirements. It kind of got to change the paradigm a little bit, and that we're going to be going back to in-person meetings unless that is an affirmative decision made to go through one of the emergency routes and whatnot. That's pretty much all. And if I was giving this conversation 6 months ago, we'd spend some more time talking about this. But since it's going to basically vaporize in 2.5 weeks, I don't know it's worth spending a lot of time on, and particularly since you all have been doing it for quite some time now.
Yeah, and I think I see Councilmember File's hand raised. Councilmember File, do you have a question?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So you were talking about remote attendance being an allowable form for council members to continue doing. I have a question related to like council rules. Each council sets up their own rules. I would assume that if this is the update, if there are standing rules, that they would probably need to be updated to match just the guidance.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, if you had a council rule that was inconsistent with what the OPMA says, you need to bring that into line. But I think the position would be that it sets the minimum standards and sets the kind of the framework. As long as you don't do something that's inconsistent with what the OPMA expects. The question about does it mandate remote participation by council members, and I haven't read it that way. So if the council had a rule that said we want either you're in person or you have to be excused, and we don't allow remote participation, that'd be something, an internal rule for the council to figure out. I don't think the OPMA doesn't speak to that level of implementation.
Thank you.
So now, we're going to go a different direction for a second. Obviously, the OPMA is all about transparency. It's all about people being able to see what's going on, except for these exceptions. And these are things called executive sessions. And these are part of regular meetings that can be special meetings that can be closed to the public. You can have a meeting that is basically it convenes and then goes straight into executive session. Sometimes meetings are called specifically for one of the stated purposes. But what's significant about it is you are limited in terms of when you go into executive session. You have to go into executive session for one of the specific reasons stated in the statute. Every time I've worked with my boards and commissions for executive session, and I suspect your council does the exact same thing, I go back to that statute and I read 110 subpart 1, and I go down through, are we talking about C or D, E, which one are we talking about? And I make that part of my agenda announcements in terms of one thing you have to do going into executive session is you have to announce why you're going into executive session. I have them use that exact language. You also have to announce, how long are you going to be in executive session? That doesn't mean that's the only time you can spend. You can extend, and this has happened to empty rooms in times when we weren't doing this remotely and people weren't watching from home, where the council has gone into executive session, and then the chair or the clerk of the board has come out into an empty room and announced to a bunch of chairs that the council session, executive session, has been extended for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And you can do this over and over again. You can take the time that you need to have that conversation. You just need to make sure that you are making those announcements. And like I said, you also have to make sure that you are reflecting why you went into executive session into the minutes. And I also recommend to folks that they put down the nitty-gritty kind of stuff as well, in terms of what time you went in, how long you said you were going to be in, how long you came out. So what time did you come out? But the thing about that is you can't come out early. So if you announce that you need 30 minutes for an executive session, and it turns out you were way wrong and you only needed 10, then you've got 20 minutes to go to get a cup of coffee or whatnot. You can't come out early, because part of the theory is that, so if it's an in-person meeting or if you're offering it online, somebody might turn the camera off. They might go to get that cup of coffee, get a quick bite of dinner. And if you come out of session early, then might miss something that they care about. It's just, it doesn't happen very often, but most of the time what I see is they get extended, and it goes on and on, that kind of thing. One thing I also recommend is, when you talk about executive session, particularly if you're using online environments, is, have some tools built for that. Use unique meeting invitations for those meetings. Use the waiting room function so that people who do somehow get a copy of the link don't just end up, basically lurking in your meeting, and the clerk of the board can control it, and things like that. But in terms of executive session, the big takeaway from it is the fact that you can only do it for the reasons that are specifically enumerated in the statute, and you can't make a decision in the executive session. You can have the discussion, but your decision moment still needs to come out to the public. But that doesn't mean that every executive session reaches a decision. Sometimes executive sessions are just a conversation and there's no decision point that comes out of them. One thing that I have commonly seen happen is that when they come out, the chair will announce, or the mayor will announce, that coming out of the executive session, the board took no action, we've made no final decisions, we are going to revisit this issue later, or something like that. Somehow announcing to folks that we haven't done anything yet. Otherwise, it's the conspiracy people you have to watch out for. In that they're like, oh, they've done something, they're just not telling us about it. They still might think you've done something and not telling them about it, but you've done what you can do to protect the city, to assure people that you're taking this seriously. I'll give you a couple of examples of executive session. One is, this is probably the most common one, is that you can go into executive session for the discussions of enforcement actions, litigation, potential litigation. You have to satisfy all three elements of this. First off, your attorney actually has to be part of the conversation. Doesn't mean they have to be in person, but they actually have to be on the call, either telephonically, on the Zoom call, on the Teams meeting, whatever tool you're using. The purpose has to be for discussing agency action and litigation, something that is likely to become a party. So it's not just a theoretical kind of thing. And then you also has to be that, having this conversation in public would likely result in adverse legal or financial consequences. My experience is that's not too hard to satisfy, in part because if you're talking about agency liability, it's easy to envision a situation where if you did this conversation in open session with opposing counsel sitting in the back row, copiously taking down notes while your attorney told you all of the weaknesses of your case and why your position was weak here but strong here, obviously that's going to have financial consequences to the agency. You see the same kind of idea though, and you can go into executive session for real estate transactions, for sales, leases. And there has to be, it's not just to have the conversation, but when having that conversation could lead to an adverse financial implication. It's easy to envision those as well. I have the same kind of idea. If you're having a conversation about, buying a new piece of property for City Hall or something like that, or because you want to expand a park and you're discussing, okay, our maximum bid is 2.5 million. Guess what they're going to offer to sell it to you for? Versus being able to, okay, here's our window. Now go negotiate us a good deal, or something like that. The other one that commonly comes up is you can go into executive session to evaluate the qualifications of an applicant for public employment. Most commonly where I see this for councils, for city councils, is like your business manager or executive officer for the city, where you are either doing their evaluations, how did they do last year? Or if you are, if your manager should decide to, leave you and go work for Cascadia College full-time or something like that, and you have to find a replacement. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to say he's going to do this, but don't want to curse you that way. But let's say, he's decided he's been there for 20 years and it's like, I'm ready for a new challenge. Something like that. You're hiring, so you're looking for a replacement. Then when you're having the conversation about, you've got 5 qualified applicants, you can go into executive session to have the conversation about, let's look at Barbara's qualifications. What makes her a strong candidate? Where do you think she's going to face some challenges? Let's look at Mike. Where does he stand? You can have those conversations in that kind of a session. We have some guidelines, some tools we can share with you in terms of how you accomplish that. If you're in those kind of situations that talk about, if you have to do a search firm or something like that, I'm happy to share with you if you ever need them. But you can have those kind of conversations in executive session. One thing you cannot do in that executive session is talk money. You cannot have the conversation about how much are we going to pay this person. That has to, by statute, happen in open session. So what happens if you get it wrong? And this is the part that really kind of makes people a little bit uneasy at time. because this is personal liability on your part. A court can impose $500 civil penalty against each council member who knowingly attends a meeting in violation of the OPMA. So hopefully, you're not having one of those moments of like, oh my goodness, those last 4 meetings we had a problem or something like that. I've watched a couple of your meetings and nothing has stood out to me going, oh my goodness, or anything like that. But that this is personal liabilities, and that's the first violation. Then it's $1,000 for each subsequent knowing violation after that. And so the courts really want you to take this personally seriously. Then on top of that, there's the award of attorney's fees for a party who's successful in seeking a remedy against the agency. And some of the other remedies actually I think could be worse, because one of the biggest tools the court has is they could declare an action you took in violation of the OPMA null and void. So think about that in terms of if you were negotiating to buy a piece of property right now, and then you get into litigation over that, and 7 months, 8 months, 9 months later, that the court says, nope, you violated the OPMA, we're going to make you go back and do it again. Where does that contract stand? Is it, if it may, there may be an argument that contract is not enforceable at all anymore, and so the person you were buying this piece of property now is going to say, well, we've had incredible property growth here in King County again, and Kenmore is not immune from that. So tack on another $100,000 and I'll re-sign the deal. And so it could have some big repercussions to the city itself in terms of, if your actions are declared null and void. One thing that commonly comes up is, what if we think we've made a mistake? We're not quite sure. One option you have is you can proactively call the legal do-over. You can go back and take action again. You can basically, go back, pretend like it didn't happen, tee up the conversation again, have the conversation without whatever it is that you were concerned about, and re-execute. So, and I've seen some agencies do that from time to time out of an abundance of caution. So if you get in those kind of situations, that's definitely one you want to have that conversation with your attorney. What do we think we have any issues here? Do we think we're good, or do we want to go back and say, just out of abundance of caution, full transparency, we're going to have this conversation again. Sometimes that's a good conversation to have, which is a great segue to consult with your attorney. That's why you have your city attorney. She's there to give you that legal advice. We don't take the place of your attorney. Like our goal here this evening was to give you information, hopefully to be able to issue spot, so that when you're going forward, you can say, oh yeah, we've got some new rules we have to accommodate here. We've got to make some changes. But take advantage of your attorney. I know she and I had a conversation about a change this morning in the OPMA that we were just like, I wonder where that's going. So those kinds of things. We're a resource for you. I'm always happy to share information. We have on our webpage our AGO opinions on the open government. We also have the open government manual, which I now need to rewrite portions of it because of the changes, but that's also available on our webpage. So take advantage of the tools you have, and I'll go back to the first one. Talk with your attorney. I'm sometimes amazed how cities, don't confer with their attorney sometimes, and sometimes it's it may cost you a little bit of money, half hour of your attorney's time, but a lot of times that's far cheaper than the litigation that may ensue, and that way you're making good informed decisions. So with that, you can officially check the box on completing your OPMA training. And I've been saying thank you very much for inviting me to spend some time with you this evening. And I do have obviously for personal reasons, I have a soft spot in my heart for Kenmore, because like, Councilmember Marshall, I grew up there and still have family there. And just interesting to see how it's changing. I mean, like back when I was growing up in Kenmore was a standalone little place, and it wasn't part of it. Really, there was a break between where Kenmore was, but then there was Lake Forest Park, and then there was kind of nothing between Lake City, and that's all changed. So it's interesting to see where you're taking it in your leadership in that role.
Thank you very much. Can we take down the presentation so I can see everybody?
Yep, I will do that right now.
And we will go to Councilmember Kugler.
Thank you so much for that overview of the OPMA, and the deep dive into that. I have a question that Councilmember Shrubnik actually asked if I could ask, and it's on public record, so I don't know if we can cover that tonight. Okay. Would you be able to talk about what we can or cannot do on social media? For example, like if we are talking about an issue and having dialogue with people on social media, does that create challenges for public records?
Ooh, that's a hot topic. I'm happy. Well, like I said, I like this topic, so I'm happy to talk about anything transparency in public records. And social media is a troublesome area because the courts don't care about, and the Public Records Act doesn't care about where a record is. What it cares about is what's the content of the record. And so when you're talking about social media, if it's within the scope of your employment, meaning that if your job requires it, your boss told you to do it, or it furthers your employer's interests. And for council members like you all, it's really that third one we're concerned about. So if it fits within your job as a council member and it has to do with matters in front of the city council, based on its content, you could have public records in your social media accounts, which is, best practice is to segregate them and have, it's tough sometimes. I totally recognize this, but have your personal Facebook page, then have your Facebook page for your political life when you're running for office, and then have your Facebook page, separate page for your work as a council member. And in an ideal world, those would all have, you'd have some archiving tools for the city, and they'd be able to capture those, because the risk you face with having these social media and conducting your work as a council member on these social medias is if there's a public records request and the records are responsive to that request, have to pull them down off of that site, and you're taking on all the management responsibility for that. And how are you going to accomplish that? And you have an obligation to archive, to save those for the records retention periods, and so you're taking on a lot of responsibility in doing it. So those are the liabilities that come from it. There's nothing that says you can't do it. It's just you have to be prepared for what happens when you get a public records request, and also thinking about the records retention pieces for it. And there's been one particular PRA litigant in the state. There's a gentleman down here in Olympia named Arthur West, who has filed a number of lawsuits on this specific issue. There's one actually two involving the city of Puyallup, one involving Cowlitz County, or I think it was Cowlitz County. And then there's also, I guess the first case of this was out of Pierce County, not involving Mr. West, but a different gentleman or a different person. And so this is where the PRA has been expanding into that, but coming back to where we've seen for the last couple of years, even prior to that, it's all about content. And what the courts care about, what the PRA cares about is, show me what that record is, and I'll decide whether it's a public record or whether it's a personal record. And sometimes the courts have said personal, and sometimes it's gone the other way. Also an extension of that is text messaging. And I encourage folks to not do it. I carry two phones that look almost exactly alike, but one's work and one's personal, and I will not cross the streams for that exact reason. And I encourage folks, let your agency manage your personal records. Excuse me, not manage your personal records, manage your work related, those records, and try to isolate your personal life as best you can. I know that's not always easy.
Councilmember File.
Thank you. This question pertains more to open public records and open public meetings. What about communications happening behind the scenes during a council meeting? Between council members or staff. Is that okay to do or not to do?
Again, it's going to be content based. It depends on what the conversation is. I know I've seen some bad press from some councils where what there was three council members during a meeting. We also had I put them up so you can see it, and we're texting. And so somebody in the audience thought they were texting each other. Turns out that one of the council members was having the family was having an issue, and that they were dealing with that. But it took a lot of work to resolve that. I would be concerned if there were conversations about the topic. It sounds analogous to email conversations or things like that aren't being done in the public view, because you could have a public meeting via email, via social media, which is someplace else you need to watch out for if you all friend yourself on Facebook or whatever social media you're using, and then start talking shop. You could have a problem there, because you're now having a meeting that didn't happen with announcement, and it didn't have an agenda. It's just kind of this thing that's evolving. So it's that same kind of concern. And some agencies have been found to violate the OPMA when they've had those offline or online conversations, is a better way to say it.
So just to wrap that up, it would be probably a good idea not to be talking about a topic that's being discussed openly during a public meeting at the time, and then having some sort of behind the scenes discussion going on.
anytime I hear the word behind the scenes, it causes me concern.
Exactly.
I would want to know what the facts were, and I'd want to know exactly what was being talked about. And is it really action? Is it something like that? But the term behind the scenes causes the light to go off, going, I've got some questions here.
Yeah, the bells and whistles, right?
Exactly. That's what I was looking for. Thank you for filling it in, because it was escaping me. The best thing I come up with was the light bulb.
I believe our city clerk had some questions. Madam Clerk?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Morgan, so much. Yes, I'm the city clerk, and I hope the council will agree that my personal assessment is that we are pretty compliant in these areas, and actually are a little bit aspirational in terms of trying to go to a hybrid model. Now, on that note, I wanted to ask you a question. If we were to give the public the option to participate remotely, there's a requirement that those people be heard, but not necessarily a requirement that the virtual participant be seen. Is it reasonable when taking virtual public comment to move away from having video on? The reason I ask is we can't control that environment, and we don't want to inadvertently expose people to something either private or, well, essentially something that maybe doesn't belong in a recorded, streamed environment. What's your take on this?
If you look at the language that the legislature has chosen, it's the opportunity to give oral testimony, and they've specifically talked about that, be able to be heard. And I know a lot of agencies, a lot of groups had a lot of really horrible things happen with the video component, and I know a lot of agencies will not turn on video for that exact reason. It might take me a minute or two to ramp up to my full fervor if I was gonna go someplace, versus if I was to grab an image and hold it up in front of the camera, it happens just that fast. And so some agencies are, we don't have that 7-second kill switch that a lot of media has and things like that, which is why I don't know specifically, but I've got to think that's why they went with the oral. That and the fact that we are fortunate sometimes on this side of the state with the infrastructure we have. Not all communities on this side of the state, but this side tends to have a bigger backbone. Versus if you get to some of the more rural places, I talked to some cities where they literally have a dial-up, or it's one step beyond dial-up. So the idea of having a full video conference just would fry their system, let alone having the space to have a meeting or things like that. So I think there was also the conversation of some practicalities.
Okay, thank you. I think you answered that question. And then I had just a couple of potpourri questions. So we now have to take public comment prior to taking any final action.
Yes.
And typically in our agendas, our public comment actually precedes any consent agenda approvals or anything like that. But sometimes it follows action done outside of an executive session. So in order to remedy that, what we would want to do is if people came out of an executive session, we would take public comment and do the action following the executive session after that segment.
Okay.
That would be the appropriate way to triage that.
Yeah, I think that, what the new amendment says that you have to take public comment prior to taking final action. So somehow you need to accomplish that. And I've talked with some agencies that are doing that kind of idea where they're putting public comment combined with the issue they're addressing. Others, I think more the majority view is to front load it towards the beginning of the meeting. But as long as you satisfy that through some method. I was having a conversation today about a hybrid approach where for some of the issues having written comment, and then for other issues like things that like the agenda that you put out and saying, well, maybe you want to do written comment for the agenda. It has to be in so many hours in front of the meeting, but for everything else we'll take oral comment or something like that. So I don't think it says you have to go but one route either. I think the key piece is you have to do it before taking final action.
And voting on the approval of the agenda, is that considered final action?
I think it's an unintended consequence. I mean, if you look at the definition of what action is in the OPMA, it says a vote or consensus. And most people approve their agenda by, I'll take a motion to approve the agenda. Somebody seconds it, and then there's a vote. 99.8% of the people out there aren't going to care. But there are a few folks out there that will, look for a technical violation, or they might seize on that for some other reason. So I don't think it's really what was, forefront in people's mind, but I think it's a downstream flow or downstream repercussion from it.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a strange conundrum. Okay, thank you for that. And I want to pivot because I have another interesting question to ask you. On page 8, you talk a little bit about what constitutes other governing bodies that are essentially governed by the Open Public Meetings Act. And I think you pull out a couple of qualifiers. We currently have a DEI task force, and we do recognize them as a formal task force because they were birthed out of the city council, and they do take public testimony or public comment at their meetings. Here's my question. If the DEI task force wanted to morph away from that or move away from that after their initial sunset date and become more of a community advising committee or a focus group, would we just need to essentially check to see that those 3 elements are no longer in play, or how would they make that transition? One of the reasons why that's important to this particular task force is because, as you know, with the Open Public Meetings Act, there's a high degree of transparency. Everything is recorded. And for people who choose to be in that task force, that might prevent them from wanting to volunteer their time or for those discussions to be organic, because they sometimes discuss sensitive topics. I hope I'm making sense, but I guess my basic question is, for a formal meeting that reports essentially to the council, has public testimony, what if they want to be less formal, continue to do the work, but no longer be maybe burdened by some of these regulatory requirements?
Whether the OPMA is going to apply to, I'm going to say the DEI 2.0 is really going to be a function of what they do. Any sub-agency, any committee that the city should create really is going to have to look at, what is it that they have? One big key is, are they advisory in nature, or do they actually have delegated authority? Do they just have the ability to, dear council, here's 3 things and here's our recommendation, and you all make the call? Or do they actually make the call? Do they actually bind the city to something? Do they conduct hearings? Do they take testimony? So it's really going to depend upon what it is that they're doing. That's probably one that's, take some time and outline what you want the DEI 2.0 to be, and then talk with legal counsel, talk with Mr. Tan about where are we still a committee, or is this now an advisory board, or what are they? Have they changed their character? But it's going to be very much based upon what it is that they're doing and what power they have.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Councilmember File.
Thank you. I had one more question related to final decisions. Sometimes we have our council comments at the end of a council meeting. We might have a topic that comes back and to discuss, and we take action at times. So it seems like it's yet another situation where final action occurs in that place. So you're saying that we have to stop and have public comment during that time too?
Yeah, again, the revisions, let's see if I have it. Make sure I can pull it up here real fast. I'll read it for you. Let me scroll down here real fast. Treatment section. Except in an emergency situation, the governing body of a public agency shall provide an opportunity at or before every regular meeting at which final action is taken for public comment. So if you break that down into its component parts, so by your example, Councilmember Field, if a final decision is a final action is taken on something, you need to be able to satisfy this portion of the OPMA when it comes online on June 9th.
Okay, and so that brings, I see our city attorney raising her hand real quickly.
If I may, Mr. Mayor?
Of course.
Thank you. And I think I wanted to clarify the opportunity for public comment is not a requirement to have it at multiple times during a regular meeting. I believe the new legislation is to provide an opportunity at the beginning portion of the of the regular meeting, which would then complete that requirement. There's no public comment requirement for every contemplated final action.
No, and I think Mr. Tan is exactly correct. It doesn't have to be, now we're talking about this and now we're going to take public comment at that. You can front load all of that to the call the meeting to order. And then the first issue is public comment on anything, talk about anything on the agenda. Or you could choose to take that to beyond that to anything you want us to be aware of. But I think it has to happen before final action.
And I'd also point out that generally, I believe according to our council rules, final action isn't actually allowed during council comments either, or initiatives. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it's not allowed. Councilmember Marshall?
So that would be okay, even if, say, a council member, as we do, introduces something that was not on the agenda in order to get it on a future agenda, looking for a second, get something on a future agenda. That'd still be okay.
I'm not seeing you're proposing final action. You're proposing a future agenda item. So it looks like you're not to the final action point from the scenario you put up.
And we already would have had public comment at the beginning of that meeting regardless. So I mean, there's a kind of a unforeseen consequence of requiring public comment prior to any final action is that we could hear public comment, adjust the agenda, and insert something that the public will then not have an opportunity to actually comment on because public comment was earlier in the agenda. There's kind of an unforeseen consequence there. Questions? I am not seeing any more hands. Well, thank you very much for your time this evening. I believe I've sat through, I think this is the second time I've sat through one of your trainings. Always learn something new, super helpful. Always a good reminder for all of us, I think.
No, I'm glad you invited me, and I'm glad you didn't call in sick, so to speak. It's like, oh, not that guy again. So thank you. But
well,
no,
I just did the online, well, not just, like 3 months ago, did the online recertification that you have to do, after election too. So
yeah, and I'm in the process of redoing all those because that recording is now no longer up to date. I've got to re-record. I'm actually re-recording that tomorrow. So
well, just as long as you don't change any of the weird photos of people talking to each other in awkward postures with voiceover, you got to keep that because it keeps it entertaining.
Well, we thought about just doing a voiceover for it and just having my voice over Nancy's and be like, that's not right. Wait a second, and be completely obvious about it, but then decided to not be quite that. So
thank you very much.
well, thank you. I hope you all have a great evening.
All right. Next on the agenda, we have the upcoming meeting schedule. That's usually just buried at the bottom of everything. We've got meetings on the 16th, the 23rd, and then our retreat the evening of the 4th and the day of the 5th. No, I mean the 3rd and the 4th. Apologies. Sorry. Evening of the 3rd, day of the 4th. And since there's nothing more to come before us, Kenmore City Council is now adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Night.
Good night, everybody.